Put it out! Put it out, begged Mary. The branches of the willow began to sway violently. There was a sound as of a wind rising and spreading outward to the branches of all the other trees round about, as though they had dropped a stone into the quiet slumber of the river valley and set up ripples of anger that ran out over the whole forest. Sam kicked at the little fire and stamped out the sparks, but Frodo, without any clear idea of why he did so, or what he hoped for, ran along the path crying, "Help! Help! Help!" It seemed to him that he could hardly hear the sound of his own shrill voice. It was blown away from him by the willow wind and drowned in a clamor of leaves as soon as the words left his mouth. He felt desperate, lost, and witless. Suddenly he stopped. There was an answer, or so he thought, but it seemed to come from behind him, away down the path further back in the forest. He turned round and listened, and soon there could be no doubt. Someone was singing a song. A deep, glad voice was singing carelessly and happily, but it was singing nonsense. "Hey dole, merry dole, ring-a-dong dillo, ring-a-dong, hop along, fall-la the willow, Tom Jolly Tom Bombadillo." Half hopeful and half afraid of some new danger, Frodo and Sam now both stood still. Suddenly, out of a long string of nonsense words, or so they seemed, the voice rose up loud and clear and burst into this song. "Hey, come, merry dole, dairy dole, my darling, light grows the weather wind and the feathered starling, down along Underhill, shining in the sunlight, waiting on the doorstep for the cold starlight. There my pretty lady is, river woman's daughter, slender as the willow wand, clearer than the water. Old Tom Bombadil, water lilies bringing, comes hopping home again. Can you hear him singing? Hey, come, merry dole, dairy dole, and merry-o, goldberry, merry yellow berry-o. Poor old willow man, you tuck your roots away. Tom's in a hurry now, evening will follow day. Tom's going home again, water lilies bringing. Hey, come, dairy dole, can you hear me singing?" Can you hear me singing? Welcome, I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. Who is Tom Bombadil? Well, if you come to The Lord of the Rings through Peter Jackson's movies, you will of course have no idea. Jackson did not consider Tom Bombadil a necessary character, and so took the hobbits on their adventure straight from the Shire to Bree and the Inn of the Prancing Pony. They never meet Old Man Willow, which is the one that Merry and Frodo are calling for help against. They never meet Tom Bombadil, the one who comes singing into the story. They never meet his wife, Goldberry. They have no adventure in the Barrow Mounds. He's simply not there. Did Jackson make a mistake? Did Tolkien make a mistake by putting this character into a story that was in fact necessary for the adventure? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, if you wonder, and if you do know Tom Bombadil from the book and are still curious about who he is, you will not be alone among Tolkien's readers. And Tolkien, in fact, was asked almost immediately when the book came out by a number of his readers, well, who is this Bombadil character and what is he? And Tolkien typically is a little bit evasive to start with, right? He has one letter that comes to him this is to Naomi Mitchison, who'd been reading page proofs of the first 2 volumes of The Lord of the Rings, and she wrote to him with a number of questions about, like, who is this character that you've put in, right? So it's even one of his readers before the book is published, and he says, "Oh well, don't worry about it." Right? He says that it's the story is mythical, and it's an imaginary mythical age, and there must be some enigmas. Tom Bombadil is one, parentheses, intentionally. Right? Other readers pressed him a little further, and he's saying, well, and this is, let me see, still to Naomi Mitchison, he's still making excuses to her and basically saying, well, Tom Bombadil's not an important person to the narrative, which you could say gave Jackson every justification that he had for leaving him out, because here's Tolkien in his own words to his own proofreader saying, I suppose he has some importance as a comment. I mean, I do not really write like this. He's just an invention who first appeared in the Oxford magazine about 1933. It's actually 1934. And he represents something that I feel important, though I would not be prepared to analyze the feeling precisely. So first he says, well, I'm to Mrs. Mitchinson, I'm happy to leave him as an enigma, and it's mythical in any way. And then he comes back to it and says, well, you know, he's not important to the narrative. He's just a feeling. He's a character that I had before. And then he goes on a little, he's like struggling with himself to figure out why he included this character in the story. The story is cast in terms of a good side and a bad side, beauty against ruthless ugliness, tyranny against kingship, moderated freedom with consent against compulsion that has long lost any object save mere power. And so why is he talking about this, right? He still hasn't explained to her who Tom Bombadil is. And somehow he's sort of saying, well, okay, Bombadil is necessary to, in some way, making sense of my myth, but I'm not sure why, besides he's a character that came from before. Well, he got pressed again by one of his close friends. This is a letter to Peter Hastings, who was a manager of the Newman Bookshop, which was a Catholic bookshop in Oxford, and he was very enthusiastic about The Lord of the Rings. This is a draft of a letter that was written in September 1954. He's very enthusiastic about The Lord of the Rings, but he had a variety of questions, and one of the ones he had, Mrs. Mitchinson was just worried about, well, like, why is this character in the story at all? Hastings got anxious about the way in which the characters themselves tried to answer the question of who Tom Bombadil is. If you've read the story, you know Frodo directly asks Goldberry, like, who is Tom Bombadil? And she says, he is. Or more to the point, oh dear, I've lost my place. As we're losing our place in the story of Tom Bombadil. So Frodo asks Goldberry directly, who is Tom Bombadil? And she says, he is as you have seen him. He is the master of wood, water, and hill. And this prompts Frodo to say, well, okay, so it belongs to him. This land belongs to him. And then she says, he says, this strange land belongs to him. No, indeed, she answered, and her smile faded. That would indeed be a burden, she added in a low voice, as if to herself. So she said he's master of wood, water, and hill, but it's not as if he's the owner of the land. The trees and the grasses and all things growing or living in the land belong each to themselves. Tom Bombadil is the master, and capital M. No one has ever caught old Tom walking in the forest, wading in the water, leaping on the hilltops under light and shadow. He has no fear. Tom Bombadil is master, lowercase m. And Hastings responds to this description with this anxiety about, well, does that mean he's God? Because as the voice from the bush answers to Moses, I sure hope I have that right. I am that I am, right? And so the I am, that declaration of existence, of being, is what Hastings here, he worries about that as if it's an expression of divinity. Does it, when you're saying that Tom is master, capital M, of wood, water, and I've done it again, I've lost my place. I do apologize. This is me feeling anxious about answering the question that I know you all have, because I'm doing this episode by special request of one of my former students saying you must wonder about Tom Bombadil. Well, if you're wondering, I do always talk about Tom Bombadil at the beginning of my Tolkien course because I think it's absolutely necessary. But he's still hard to talk about. So he's master of wood, water, and hill. What does that mean? Well, Hastings sort of pushes Tolkien, and Tolkien gets a little crotchety, and he says, you remind me of a Protestant relation who to me objected to the modern Catholic habit of calling priests father, because the name father belonged only to the first person, citing last Sunday's epistle inappositely, since that says ex quo. Lots of other characters are called master. And if in time Tom was primeval, he was eldest in time. But Goldberry and Tom are referring to the mystery of names. See and ponder Tom's words in Volume 1, page 142, etc., etc. And goes into this sort of involved discussion of is, and we need not go into the sublimities of I am that am, which is what God says to Moses, which is quite different from he is, footnote, only the first person of worlds or anything can be unique. If you say he is, there must be more than one, and created subexistence is implied. I can say he is of Winston Churchill as well as Tom Bombadil, surely. It's interesting to see Tolkien struggling so much with answering and not answering these questions. First he says, well, he's just, he's an enigma. Well, okay, he's not necessary. Well, he's not God. I don't think Tom needs philosophizing about, and is not improved by it. Again, trying to dodge it. But many have found him an odd, or and indeed discordant ingredient. And then here he goes with his admission again. In historical fact, I put him in because I had already invented him independently. He first appeared in the Oxford magazine and wanted an adventure on the way. But I kept him in, and as he was, because he represents certain things otherwise left out. I do not mean him to be an allegory, of course not, or I should not have given him so particular, individual, and ridiculous a name, but the name was there from before, from the poem in the Oxford magazine, so this is again dodging it. But again, Tolkien is saying, I put him in, he's not an allegory, but allegory is the only mode of exhibiting certain functions. He is then an allegory or an exemplar, a particular embodying of pure, real, natural science. This fits with he's master of wood, water, and hill, right? Wood, water, and hill. So he's the sort of nature element that people often point to when they're thinking about Bombadil. The spirit that desires knowledge of other things, their history and nature, because they are other and wholly independent of the inquiring mind. A spirit coeval with the rational mind and entirely unconcerned with doing anything with the knowledge. He simply enjoys the wood and the water and the hill, as it were. Zoology and botany, not cattle breeding or agriculture. Even the elves hardly show this. They are primarily art. And now we're sort of wandering off. Also, Tom Bombadil exhibits another point in his attitude to his ring and his failure. Blah, 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 blah. It's so interesting for watching Tolkien, who is typically much clearer about his purposes and his storytelling. We've been talking about the way in which he understands mythology and the sort of robust answer that he gave to Lewis about the importance of myth, saying we create still in the image in which we are made. And yet here, challenged at several different levels by his editor, by his readers, by his friend, to explain where this character came from, he stumbles and stumbles and stumbles and says, well, okay, maybe he's an allegory, maybe he's philosophy, but I don't want to philosophize too much about him. It's a sort of simple problem and a very complex problem, and that, I think, is, of course, why people love wondering about who Tom Bombadil is. And if you think about the role that Tom has in The Lord of the Rings, it is very, very interesting. And simply on the adventure that the hobbits have in encountering him, you could say, well, why wouldn't Jackson include him in the movie? Why aren't some of the things that happen when the hobbits meet Tom actually necessary to the adventure of the ring? Well, to start with, Tom rescues them from being eaten, or not eaten. I mean, it's unclear exactly what Old Man Willow wants to do with the hobbits, that they've fallen asleep because he's sort of sung them or whispered them this sleepy tree song, and the tree is trying to hold them down under the water or pinch them, and Mary gets caught in the tree, and Frodo gets held under the water. I've forgotten exactly. See, it's like it doesn't. You sort of, they're in the old forest and falling into this slumber that they're not sure how to wake out from. And Tom's singing comes and saves them from that sleeping. They also, after they've seen Tom and he sends them off, towards the right road so that they can end up on the road to Bree, they get distracted, fall asleep again, and end up waking up prisoners of the Barrow-wights. And so Tom again has to show up and wake them up, as it were, and send them off. So sleeping and waking are very important elements in this story. But it's the first adventures that they have leaving the Shire, so why not include them? That you get to meet Goldberry, this river daughter, and you could say, well, Goldberry should be, in some respects, a very interesting female character. Certainly, if we're trying to put female characters into the stories, Goldberry is a mystery of her own, and a very interesting foil to, say, Galadriel. Goldberry sits over the river and her river daughter character, as Galadriel does in Lothlorien. Perhaps, Jackson might have been enticed to include her for those reasons. Very interestingly, of course, the ring has no power over Tom, as Frodo finds out when he tries to hide, right? That Tom has asked them about their adventures and said, "Show me the ring," and Frodo shows Tom the ring, and he takes it, puts it on, and it has zero effect on him. And then Frodo, wondering whether or not the ring still works, tries to sneak, to put it on and sneak away, and Tom can see him. So the ring is interestingly powerless over Tom. They talk about Tom at the Council of Elrond, and Elrond specifically calls Tom Eärwan bin Adar, oldest and fatherless, saying that the dwarves have other names for him, and that he has been around from before even the elves know. But he's somehow none of these. He's like he's a little bit bigger than the hobbits, but he's not as tall as the man. He's not an elf. He's not a wizard. He seems to be this sort of singular character. That he's said to be oldest, but he's not an Ent, obviously, even though he's associated with the trees. And his forest, the old forest, is like an analog to Fangorn. And yet Tom Bombadil is not like Treebeard. He's not like Fangorn in eldest in that sense. Fangorn, Treebeard, is described as the oldest living thing. So if Tom is eldest, does that mean he's not living? All of these, layer and layer and layering mysteries. And of course, Tom Bombadil sings. Now, I'm going to do a full episode on the problem of verse and poetry and so forth. But if you like or dislike Tom Bombadil, probably it comes down to whether or not you like or dislike his singing. Whether it sounds like nonsense rhyme, whether it sounds like, something that a serious story, concerned with great matters of dominion and control and, battle between good and evil doesn't need. Why is he singing? What is he there for? Well, some of it, and this is, we're playing through these readings and conversations with Tolkien's creative process and the ways in which Tolkien, sort of dug around in his own storytelling for hints about what he was up to. The truth of the matter is, and Tolkien kept saying that, was this, he'd written some poems long before, and when Stanley Unwin started asking him for more material to, after The Hobbit was so successful as a publication, Tolkien does, as those of us who are writers or creators or sub-creators do often. It's like you start digging around in your drawer and in the hope that you can transform something that you've already done into something that your publisher might like to bring out. I sent Vox a few things. He tells me they won't sell. And that is kind of what happened, unfortunately, to Tolkien's early efforts at figuring out something that he could send to Unwin. And this is what he wrote in December 1937. He'd been trying to get Unwin interested in the Silmarillion, of course, because the stories from the Silmarillion already exist long before The Hobbit. He'd written The Hobbit, and as he said to Unwin, he never quite intended The Hobbit to be part of that Silmarillion story cycle. He's saying in this letter, this is December 1937, that my chief joy comes from learning the Silmarillion is not rejected with scorn. of course, it was never published during his lifetime, so it wasn't so much rejected with scorn as, you got anything else that we might use? He's still hopeful, right? And he's saying, well, I like these tales. They're not Celtic. They, da 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 da. I don't think any of the stuff I dropped on you filled the bill. He's digging around in the things that he's already written, hoping that Unwin is going to be sufficiently interested to publish something else. And this is the first mention that we have of what he sort of why Tom Bombadil probably, it's going to end up in the story. He's saying, I think it's plain that quite apart from it, a sequel or successor to The Hobbit is called for. I promise to give this thought and attention, but I'm sure you will sympathize when I say that the construction of elaborate and consistent mythology in 2 languages rather occupies the mind, and the Silmarils are in my heart. He's desperately always wanting that grand narrative to be the thing that Unwin will publish. So that goodness knows what will happen. Mr. Baggins, that's The Hobbit, obviously. Mr. Baggins began as a comic tale among conventional and inconsistent Grimm's fairy tale dwarves, and got drawn into the edge of it so that even Sauron the Terrible peeped over the edge, right? That Sauron existed prior to The Hobbit, and there's the mention of the necromancer in The Hobbit, and so there's this sort of glimmering of the other stories outside of The Hobbit, even though The Hobbit itself was never really meant to be about the grand legend. And what more can hobbits do? They can be comic, but their comedy is suburban unless it is set against things more elemental. But the real fun about orcs and dragons, to my mind, was before their time. Perhaps a new, if similar, line? Do you think Tom Bombadil, the spirit of the vanishing Oxford and Berkshire countryside, could be made into the hero of a story? Or is he, as I suspect, fully enshrined in the enclosed verses? Still, I can enlarge the portrait. So this is Tolkien trying in December 1937, after the Hobbit, to figure out some other way to flesh out a story that he could give to Unwin that would entice Unwin sufficiently. He's still trying to tempt him into playing with that larger legendarium, because that's always what Tolkien wanted to achieve. And he keeps saying, I never meant the hobbits to be part of that, and yet they kind of stumbled into it, and I'm not sure that they can be anything other than comic. Well, maybe this Tom Bombadil character can. Now we get another sort of glimpse of this storytelling making in what was eventually republished as that poem that came out in the Oxford magazine in 1934, with a republication of The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, making that poem the beginning of the collection. And there's a second poem that he wrote as well to go with this later publication. This is from 1962. And by this time now, Tom Bombadil has been, as it were, folded into the Hobbit storytelling, and we have the pretense that knowledge of Tom Bombadil comes from Buckland, numbers 1 and 2 in the collection. So The Adventures of Tom Bombadil and the second Tom Bombadil poem, we learn from the preface to the poem collection, evidently come from the Buckland. They show more knowledge of that country and of the Dingle, the wooded valley of the Withywindle, than any hobbits west of the Marish were likely to possess. They also show that the Bucklanders knew Bombadil. Footnote, indeed they probably gave him this name. It is Bucklandish in form, to add to his many older ones. So you see Tolkien, as usual, trying to make out as if the whole legendarium was consistent and meaningful. And I wrote all of these things. I found them in the bottom of my drawer, and therefore they are actually all significant. Well, if we step outside a little bit of the legendarium itself and say, as Tolkien kept admitting, historically in his own life he'd written these nonsense rhymes earlier, and they probably were never meant to be about hobbits or the Shire, because they pre-existed hobbits in the Shire, which is, in the story, Tom pre-exists the hobbits in the Shire, because, well, in Tolkien's own literary production he had But on the other hand, Tom didn't pre-exist the Silmarillion because, in fact, those stories had already been being written. And yet again, Tolkien is wrestling with that problem of where do these stories come from in my imagination? Well, there is a hint, to a certain extent, in Tolkien saying that Tom Bombadil is somehow the spirit of the landscape, right? The Berkshire and Oxford countryside. And one of the things that Tom Shippey has suggested in his readings, this is from Shippey's discussion, one of the things that Shippey suggests in his reading of the Bombadil poem is that in fact what Tolkien was doing was playing with various features of the landscape. So here's Tom Bombadil, and this is him in his sort of plainest original form, simply as a character who's sort of tripping through the landscape, right? Old Tom Bombadil was a merry fellow, bright blue his jacket was, and his boots were yellow, green were his girdle and his breeches all leather, he wore in his tall hat a swan wing feather. He lived up under hill where the withy windle ran from a grassy well down into the dingle. Old Tom in summertime walked about the meadows, gathering the buttercups running after shadows, tickling the bumblebees that buzzed among the flowers, sitting by the waterside for hours upon hours. Then his beard dangled long down into the water. Up came Goldberry, the river woman's daughter, pulled Tom's hanging hair, in he went a-wallowing under the water lilies, bubbling and a-swallowing. Hey, Tom Bombadil, whither are you going? Said fair Goldberry. Bubbles are you blowing, frightening the finny fish and the brown water rat, startling the dab chicks and drowning your feather hat. You bring it back again, there is a pretty maiden, said Tom Bombadil, I do not care for waiting. Go down, sleep again, where the pools are shady, far below willow roots, little water lady. Back to her mother's house in the deepest hollow swam young Goldberry, but Tom he would not follow. O'er knotted willow roots he sat in sunny weather, drying his yellow boots and his draggled feather. Up woke Willowman, began upon his singing, sang Tom fast asleep, under branches swinging. In a crack, caught him tight, snick it closed together, trapped Tom Bombadil, coat and hat and feather. Ha, Tom Bombadil, what you be a-thinking, peeping inside my house, watching me a-drinking, deep in my wooden house, tickling me with feather, dripping wet down my face like a rainy weather. You let me out again, old man Willow, I am stiff lying here, there's no sort of pillow. Your hard cracked roots, drink your river water, go back to sleep again like the river daughter. Willowman let him loose when he heard him speaking, locked fast his wooden house, muttering and creaking, whispering inside the tree, out from Willy Dingle. Tom went walking up on the withy windle. Under the forest eaves he sat a while a-listening, on the boughs piping birds were chirruping and whistling. Butterflies about his head went quivering and winking, until gray clouds grew up as the sun was sinking. It goes on. He meets a badger who tries to drag him into his hole, and he meets the Barrow-wight who says, hey, dark came under hill, Tommy lit a candle, upstairs creaking rent turned the door handle. Ho, Tom Bombadil, look what night has brought you, I am here behind the door, now at last I've caught you. You forgotten Barrow-wight, dwelling in the old mound, up there on hilltop with the ring of stones round. He's got loose again, under earth he'll take you, poor Tom Bombadil, pale and cold he'll make you. Go out, shut the door, never come back after, take away gleaming eyes, take your hollow laughter. Go back to grassy mound, on your stony pillow, lay down your bony head like old man Willow, like young Goldberry and badger folk in burrow, go back to buried gold and forgotten sorrow. So the Barrow-wight goes away, and then Bombadil goes and catches the river daughter and marries her, catches her, caught her fast, brings her to his home, sets her up, they have a wedding, and everybody's happy, and he sings, right? Now, what Shippey explains is this was just it was a nonsense poem, and if you think about what we talked about with Mythopoeia last time, and that Mythopoeia seems to be written before this poem was published, Tolkien is playing with poetry, he's playing with his languages, he's playing with sort of bits and pieces that he's trying to find to make his legendarium. And what he does in this Adventures of Tom Bombadil is give Tom this adventure across the Oxfordshire and Berkshire landscape, including willowy rivers with willows sleeping over them, like the Cherwell that would run through Oxford. He has them meet some of the animals, like the badger, and he has a barrow wight come, and in this story, the barrow wight seems to show up in Tom's own house rather than Tom going into the barrow. But it's an adventure across the landscape, and if you know anything about the Oxfordshire landscape, and in particular, you'll know things like it's where the White Horse is carved into the hill, right? The Uffington White Horse. There's a castle, an old Iron Age fort, the Uffington Castle in the region, and pertinent to our theme of the Forge of Tolkien, there is a barrow mound known as Wayland's Smithy. That's certainly not the name that it had when it was originally built back in the Bronze Age, say 3600, 3400 BC. But it's a name that was given in the early Middle Ages, associating stories with the pre-Christian smith Wayland. We'll talk more about that another time. But the point of it is that Tolkien is playing off of finding elements in his own surroundings to make stories out of, and he gives Tom Bombadil these various adventures. So what and the Goldberry adventure is very interesting because she's River Daughter, and she tries to drown Tom. She grabs him by his beard, as it were, and pulls him under. And in that respect, it's not really clear that she's she's certainly not just an innocent, lovely girl spirit, right? River Daughter. She is potentially a hag, or her mother is, like unto Grendel's mother in Beowulf, who is a water demon, right? And Shippey again points to ways in which the characters that show up in the poem about Bombadil would have resonance because of these associations with the Old English poems. Wayland the Smith is mentioned in Beowulf as making Beowulf's male, right? So we have barrow mounds, we have water hags, we have beasts that would drag him under, and so there's this adventure in the landscape. The willow tries to catch Tom and closes with a snick, just like it does over Pippin in the story with the hobbits. So it's clear when Tolkien is trying to figure out what adventure he's going to send the hobbits on once they get out of the Shire, what he has kind of in his lumber sitting over here is a potential story about a tree and a river daughter and some barrows, and well, Tom's in there, and so okay, maybe I'll draft it out and give the hobbits those adventures. And we could say, well, and that's sufficient. It fits with the kind of landscape meditations that clearly go into crafting the whole of the Lord of the Rings, that they're walking across Middle-earth and introducing you to its various settings, and the sense of belonging in Middle-earth is very, very significant for the characters. But for someone who revised and revised and revised and revised his work to the great frustration of his publishers, his son Christopher, his readers who wished that he had published more things. I mean, he's definitely the absolute opposite of C.S. Lewis, who seemed to publish as he drafted. That is a pretty unsatisfying answer to me. And I think that Tolkien realized in the long run that Tom really does belong in the story, as, contrary to his own apologizing, absolutely necessary to the story because of the adventures that he gives the hobbits that they would not have had without Tom Bombadil. Now, let's think a little bit more carefully about what actually happens to the hobbits when they meet Tom. It's not just that they have a variety of adventures with the Barrow-wights and the the tree, although I've suggested to you something there already about what I think is going on, in that both of the adventures that they have are sleeping adventures, right? That the tree is going to put them to sleep, and Tom wakes them back up, and the barrow wights are trying to put them to sleep, and he saves them from that sleep, and that they, when they're with him, they dream, which is very significant. And I'm realizing I have a thought that I was thinking something else there. They sleep. He wakes them from sleeping. He wakes them from sleeping by singing, and he does something else, which I think is absolutely critical to the actual effect of the story. That if you saw Jackson's movies and felt this kind of absence of the magic, I say it's because Jackson left Tom Bombadil out. Now let's think about what happens to the hobbits in the actual scenes with Tom Bombadil. After he rescues them from the tree, he dances off, singing, and they start trying to follow him, right? And there's this very interesting passage where they're still not at his house, and they're still a bit lost in the forest, and it becomes difficult, right? It became difficult to follow the path, and they were very tired. Their legs seemed leaden. Strange, furtive noises ran among the bushes and reeds on either side of them, and if they looked up to the pale sky, they caught sight of queer, gnarled and knobby faces that gloomed dark against the twilight and leered down at them from the high bank and the edges of the wood. They began to feel that all this country was unreal, and that they were stumbling through an ominous dream that led to no awakening. They're not sure whether they're awake, right? They feel like they're in this, well, what, right? What exactly is it that they're doing? They're stumbling through this dream, and they finally get to the house, and when they find it, it's like, if you notice the imagery that is swirling around Tom throughout all of their encounters with him, it's water, right? There's the river that the willow lives by, and that they are going to be drowned in, and Bombadil saves them from. They find out with, Goldberry is a river daughter. She's daughter of the river. Golly, I'm tangling up. It's interesting that I can't speak as fluently as I'd like to in this episode, because one of the things that the hobbits find is that the more they listen to Tom, the more sing-song and joyous their language gets, and I'm finding that exactly the opposite. I'm feeling sort of tangled up, like my own speech is caught in the gnarly roots of Old Man Willow, and I'm wanting to sing to you and I can't. I think that's fascinating and interesting. I need to listen better to Tom right now. All right, so they encounter him along a river. He's married to a river daughter. That they spend the time that they do in Tom's house because it's raining for the second day, and he's saying that's Goldberry's washing day, so they're going to stay inside. When it clears up and they're able to go out and hopefully make it to the road to Bree, they get trapped on the Barrow Downs by a mist, right? Everything is water imagery, right? There's lots and lots and lots of water imagery, countered with the image of the house, right? And it's like they're stumbling through the forest. They're not sure where they are. They're worried that they're trapped in this dream that they can't wake from. And suddenly they see finally the house, and you've got the dark and the gloom and the sort of wateriness, and then a light shines out that is the house. Suddenly, down again the path went, and then up again, up a long smooth hillside of turf towards the light. Suddenly a wide yellow beam flowed out brightly from a door that was opened. This lovely image of this light bursts into the darkness. There was Tom Bombadil's house before them, up, down, under hill. Behind it, a steep shoulder of the land lay gray and bare, and beyond that the dark shapes of the Barrow Downs stalked away into the eastern night. They all hurried forward, hobbits and ponies. Already half their weariness and all their fears had fallen from them. So they're worrying about being trapped in this dream, and they see the light streaming out of the doorway, and their hearts are lightened, and they run towards the light. Hey, come Merry-Dole, rolled out the song to greet them. Hey, come Derry-Dole, hop along my hearties, hobbits, ponies all, we are fond of parties. Now let the fun begin, let us sing together. Then another clear voice, as young and as ancient as spring, like the sound of a song of a glad water flowing down into the night from a bright morning in the hills, came falling like silver to meet them. Now let the song begin, let us sing together of sun, stars, moon and mist, rain and cloudy weather, light on the budding leaf, dew on the feather, wind on the open hill, bells on the heather, reeds by the shady pool, lilies on the water, old Tom Bombadil and the river daughter. So it's true that Tom is associated with land, but he's also associated with the water, and with Goldberry he's associated with the sun and the moon and the stars and the light. It's very the fullness of creation, definitely. And in his original song, we have shining in the sunlight, shining in the starlight. There's lots of imagery of light and the light shining through all of this watery imagery. Now, when they meet Goldberry, they find her surrounded by candles, right? That she's spring up lightly up and over the lily bowls, and they have her, right. So they see her, right? A long, low room. On the table of dark polished wood stood many candles, tall and yellow, burning brightly. In a chair at the far end of the room facing the outer door sat a woman. Her long yellow hair rippled down her shoulders. Her gown was green as young reeds, shot with silver like beads of dew, and her belt was of gold, shaped like a chain of flag lilies set with pale blue eyes of forget-me-nots. Around her feet, in wide vessels of green and brown earthenware, white water lilies were floating, so that she seemed to be enthroned in the midst of a pool. So she's this water goddess, or deity, some kind of water power, spirit, surrounded by candles, and all of this, her hair is yellow, and there's all this golden imagery, the white lilies, white gold, green, water. Get all of that imagery into your head, right? So, and this is, I'm going to say, is a general clue to understanding what I think Tolkien is up to in all of his storytellings, that he'll give you this color imagery, and you'll be thinking, I mean, what's interesting about it is you'll think that it's often fancy colors, like, you know, smaragdus rather than green. It's an emerald green, or cerulean rather than blue. And he'll just say green and blue and white and silver, and it's very simple color descriptors, but you will be left with this sense of brilliance and sunlight streaming through all of the colors and light. Pay attention to how he is creating those effects. And here it is with these candles surrounding Goldberry, sitting in the midst of all of this water. And what happens to Frodo when he sees Goldberry is also very instructive. So he cries out, "Fair Lady Goldberry," said Frodo at last, feeling his heart moved with a joy that he did not understand. He stood, as he had at times stood, enchanted by fair elven voices. Enchanted. He's enchanted. Think about that word, enchanted. What's happened? But the spell that was now laid upon him was different. Less keen and lofty was the delight, but deeper and nearer to mortal heart, marvelous and yet not strange. "Fair Lady Goldberry," he said again, "now the joy that was hidden in the songs we heard is made plain to me. O slender as a willow wand, O clearer than clear water, O reed by the living pool, fair river daughter, O springtime and summertime and spring again after, O wind on the waterfall and the leaves' laughter." And he doesn't know where this song comes from, right? He's been enchanted. He's caught in a spell. Now the joy that was hidden in the songs we heard is made plain to me. Joy is hidden in songs. What's the word of enchanting? It's enchanting. The singing has cast a spell that the hobbits are now starting to feel, and this spell is one of great joy. And Goldberry laughs and calls Frodo something very significant when he does this. "Welcome," she said. "I had not heard that the folk of the Shire were so sweet-tongued. But I see you are an elf friend. The light in your eyes and the ring in your voice tells us this is a merry meeting." So, elf friend is a very interesting characterization that we are going to have to talk about more. His singing is filled with joy. He has a light in his eyes and there's a ring in his voice. All of this comes out of, if you were irritated at Tom singing, think about why. And what singing is, and why Tolkien's going to put all of these nonsense songs, all of these songs into his narrative. And remember that the character of Tom Bombadil was born in a song, effectively, right? That Tolkien wrote the verse first, gave Tom all of those adventures, and the reflection that the characters have on who Tom Bombadil is in the course of this scene comes out of their responding to his song. Okay, so we've got, they feel like they're in a dream. They're not sure about that. The water and light imagery, and this enchantment, this singing, this enchantment that is hidden in the songs. And then think what else they do while they're there, right? Tom says, okay, they've just been lost in the forest and they're all dirty, right? So they wash. So they have a wash, and then they eat. And then they take great joy from the eating and drinking that they do. The drink in their drinking bowls seemed to be clear, cold water, yet it went to their hearts like wine. Water turned into wine. My students complain about this all the time, but I promise you it's actually in this, right? You cannot understand Tolkien if you don't realize that this is probably one of the greatest Christian writers ever in his imagination, and that when he is embedding layers of imagery into his storytelling, you must be paying very, very close attention. The drink in their drinking bowls went to their hearts like wine. They became suddenly aware that they were singing merrily, as if it was easier and more natural than talking. That they're filled with joy in this house where they've been washed clean and there's light, and they sing more easily than they speak now. Now that night they have a series of very interesting dreams, and I'm going to talk through the problem of what Tolkien does with all this dreaming in more depth in a future episode. That Frodo has a dream, which we learn later was seeing Gandalf trapped at Orthanc, right? So there's a sort of prophetic problem in what exactly Frodo is seeing. Pippin has this tree imagery, which Pippin and Merry are going to be the ones that obviously meet with Fangorn, with Treebeard. So perhaps it's pointing to somehow they are going to be much more closely associated with the tree's future. Merry has this dream of nearly drowning again, and so they're learning something from these dreams. Sam, of course, doesn't dream and sleeps like a log, which is curious. Now they're going to have future dreams when they're in the barrow, so we're going to need to understand what's happening with that sense, where they prophecies or they re-experiencing the past, something like that. But the hobbits all deeply dream, and Frodo has a very important dream while they're at Tom Bombadil's house, right? And then the next day they wake up and they can't go anywhere because it's Goldberry's washing day. And here, I think, is where Tolkien realized who Tom actually was for himself and for the hobbits, and therefore the absolute necessity that Tom has for the enchantment of the story. So Tom says this is Goldberry's washing day and her autumn cleaning, too wet for hobbit folk. Let them rest while they are able. It's a good day for long tales, for questions and for answers, so Tom will start the talking. He then told them many remarkable stories, sometimes half as if speaking to himself, sometimes looking at them suddenly with a bright blue eye under his brows. Often his voice would turn to song, and he would get out of his chair and dance about. He told them tales of bees and flowers, the ways of trees, and the strange creatures of the forest, about the evil things and good things, things friendly and things unfriendly, cruel things and kind things, and secrets hidden under brambles. As they listened, they began to understand the lives of the forest, apart from themselves, indeed to feel themselves as the strangers where all other things were at home. Moving constantly in and out of his talk was Old Man Willow, and Frodo learned now enough to content him, indeed more than enough, for it was not comfortable lore. Tom's words laid bare the hearts of trees, and their thoughts, which were often dark and strange, and filled with a hatred of things that go free upon the earth, gnawing, biting, breaking, hacking and burning, destroyers and usurpers. It was not called the Old Forest without reason, for it was indeed ancient, a survivor of vast forgotten woods, and in it there lived yet, aging no quicker than the hills, the fathers of trees, remembering times when they were lords. The countless years had filled them with pride and rooted wisdom, and with malice. But none were more dangerous than the great Willow. His heart was rotten, but his strength was green, and he was cunning and a master of winds, and his song and thought ran through the woods on both sides of the river. His grey thirsty spirit drew power out of the earth and spread like fine root threads in the ground, and invisible twig fingers in the air, till it had under its dominion nearly all the trees of the forest, from the hedge to the downs. Suddenly Tom's talk left the woods and went leaping up the young stream, over bubbling waterfalls, over pebbles and worn rocks, and among small flowers and close grass and wet crannies, wandering at last up to the downs. They heard of the great barrows and the green mounds, and the stone rings upon the hills and in the hollows upon the hills. Sheep were bleating in flocks. Green walls and white walls rose. There were fortresses on the heights. Kings of little kingdoms fought together, and the young sun shone like fire on the red metal of their new and greedy swords. There was victory and defeat, and towers fell, fortresses were burned, and flames went up into the sky. Gold was piled on the biers of dead kings and queens, and mounds covered them, and the stone doors were shut. And the grass grew over all. Sheep walked for a while biting the grass, but soon the hills were empty again. A shadow came out of dark places far away, and the bones were stirred in the mounds. Barrow-wights walked in the hollow places, with the clink of rings on cold fingers, and gold chains in the wind. Stone rings grinned out of the ground like broken teeth in the moonlight. The hobbits shuddered. Even in the Shire, the rumor of the Barrow-wights of the Barrow Downs beyond the forest had been heard, but it was not a tale that any hobbit liked to listen to, even by a comfortable fireside far away. These four now suddenly remembered what the joy of this house had driven from their minds, the house of Tom Bombadil nestled under the very shoulder of these dreaded hills. They lost the thread of his tale and shifted uneasily, looking aside at one another. When they caught his words again, they found that he had now wandered into the strange regions beyond their memory and beyond their waking thought, into times when the world was wider and the seas flowed straight to the western shore, and still on and back Tom went singing out into the ancient starlight when only the elf sires were awake. Then suddenly he stopped, and they saw that he nodded as if he was falling asleep. The hobbit sat still before him, enchanted, and it seemed as if, under the spell of his words, the wind had gone and the cloud had dried up and the day had been withdrawn, and darkness had come from east and west, and all the sky was filled with the light of white stars. Whether the morning and evening of one day or of many days had passed, Frodo could not tell. He did not feel either hungry or tired, only filled with wonder. The stars shone through the window, and the silence of the heavens seemed to be round him. He spoke at last out of his wonder and a sudden fear of that silence. "Who are you, master?" he asked. What?" said Tom, sitting up, his eyes glinting in the gloom. "Don't you know my name yet? That's the only answer. Tell me. Who are you, alone, yourself, and nameless? But you are young and I am old. Eldest, that's what I am. Mark my words, my friends. Tom was here before the river and the trees. Tom remembers the first raindrop and the first acorn. He made paths before the big people and saw the little people arriving. He was here before the kings and the graves and the Barrow-wights. When the elves passed westward, Tom was here already, before the seas were bent. He knew the dark under the stars when it was fearless, before the dark Lord came from outside." The shadow seemed to pass by the window, and the hobbits glanced hastily through the panes. When they turned again, Goldberry stood in the door behind, framed in light. She held a candle, shielding its flame from the draught with her hand, and the light flowed through it like sunlight through a white shell. Now that, to me, is one of the single most important passages in the whole of The Lord of the Rings. You remember we started with this moment when Sam realizes that he and Frodo are in the same tale still. How does he know that tale? How do you know that you're in the same tale still? When do you find out? Water imagery with candles is baptismal. I think what is happening here is, in the story's literal terms, the hobbits are baptized, but thinking about the way in which they're brought into the story, right? They're suddenly realizing how they are part of this story that goes back to the beginning of everything, right? And it's wonderful. The morning or evening of one day or of many. And there was morning and there was evening one day. Tolkien has the scriptures so deeply embedded in his imagination that he can't help but write them always, right? And he told Unwin, when he was trying to figure out what to do, December 1937, he was trying to figure out what to do next with his Hobbit stories, and realizing that his hobbits had sort of crept into this larger legendarium, and well, maybe Tom could fit it there. Tolkien only ever wrote one story because he's always writing within the one story. He's always writing within the single story of creation and redemption, and finding yourself a part of that great story of creation. And that what he has Tom tell the hobbits is in fact the story of creation, right? That he's telling the stories of the trees and the animals. He's telling them, taking them back in time to when there were only stars, and they don't know how many days have passed. I mean, that's a lovely moment, and that his telling, his telling is this enchanting. It's bringing them into the song. It's bringing them into the song, as we will find, that made everything, right? The music of creation, which is the way Tolkien tends to think about creation for very good theological reasons. And that Tom is the one who, by way of his nonsense that they start being able to hear as actually stories, initiates them into the adventure that they're about to go on. Otherwise, they don't know what it means, right? And that there's this moment when they go from the Shire, instead of, as they do in the movies, they go across the waters, and they go across the water and escape from the riders and end up in Bree, and that's that they've gone from their homely existence in the Shire to the meeting with Aragorn, and without actually ever being as it were washed by the well, if it's baptismal imagery, they've been baptized into the death and resurrection, which is sort of interesting because they do die and rise again. They're in the barrows, right? And Tom has to wake them up and rescue them, and Mary has that other dreaming that he's been stabbed through the heart, and he wakes them up. If you notice what happens after Tom rescues them from the Barrow Wights, they're naked and they roll around on the grass to wake themselves back up. And he goes into the barrow and brings them new clothes. That he gives them both new clothes and their swords, which, in the sort of overlapping and overlaying of the stories, that Mary is given the blade with which he stabs the Witch King when he and Eowyn are fighting the Witch King, and he would not have it and would not have that anchor to the previous story if he hadn't gotten it from the barrow and been given it by Tom. So that the scene with the episode with Tom Bombadil is absolutely necessary to fold the hobbits into the legendarium itself, without which the hobbits don't belong, right? And there's that constant refrain, like they don't feel like they belong in the old forest. The trees are telling them they don't belong. They get lost very easily. They've fallen into a dream, and they're not. Do they ever, in fact, wake up? And we'll play with that dream imagery. That Tom is their initiation into fairy, but he's also their initiation into reality, and he does it by way of singing. Well, when I make this suggestion to my students in my campus course, the campus version of this course, I suggest to them that there is not just sort of generic liturgical parallels here with what the hobbits have gone through, but also a very specific gospel parallel of this finding yourself in a story and being enchanted by it, that I'm pretty sure Tolkien would have had in his heart, because he knew these stories very well. And it's the one when Jesus, having been resurrected in the Gospel of Luke at the end, meets up with two of the disciples who are distraught at his crucifixion and don't yet know that he's risen, and they're upset, and Jesus shows up sort of traveling. They're on their way to Emmaus, right? This is the story on the way to Emmaus. Jesus joins the two. They're walking from Jerusalem, and he says, "What are you talking about?" And there's like, "You don't know? Are you the only one who doesn't know what has happened in these days?" And they say, he says, "What things happen?" And they say, "Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in work and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and princes delivered him to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we hoped that it was he that should have redeemed Israel, and now besides all this, to this day is the third day since these things were done. And yet certain women also of our company affrighted us, who before it was light were at the sepulchre, and not finding his body came, saying they had seen a vision of angels who say that he is alive. And some of our people went to the sepulchre and found it so, as the women had said, but they found him not. And he said to them, O foolish and slow of heart, to believe in all things which the prophets have spoken, ought not Christ to have suffered these things, and so enter into his glory?" And here's the significant moment. "And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things that were concerning him. And they drew nigh to the town whither they were going, and he made as though he would go no further. But they constrained him, saying, Stay with us, because it is towards evening, and the day is now far spent. And he went in with them. And it came to pass, whilst he was at table with them, he took bread and blessed, and brake it, and gave to them. And their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished out of their sight. And they said one to the other, Was not our heart burning within us, while he spoke in the way, and opened to us the scriptures?" And then they go back to Jerusalem. What's extremely important in that passage, in this story, is they don't recognize him until two things happen. One, he has to tell them the story, and two, he has to eat with them, right? And you think about, these are the two things that happen for the hobbits in it with Tom Bombadil, that they eat, and you could say they eat a lot, right? The second breakfast and stuff like that. But it's very, they eat, and there's a big deal made about the food that Tom Bombadil gives them, and he tells them stories. And in that moment, it's that first moment when they start realizing that they are in that story. Now, this, if you're familiar at all with the way in which catechesis works, or sort of instruction in becoming a Christian, one of the things that has to happen is you're told the stories, and as you are told the stories, given this understanding that you yourself belong in them, right? So when I say that the hobbits are here baptized, they're given a role in the story. They're given a sense that they actually belong in the story because now they know it. And that enchantment, that spellbinding quality of Tom's singing to them, which you could say is almost liturgical, of course it's chant, is the thing that enables them to carry on in their adventure in the long run, because it's only in those moments when they recognize the significance of what's going on around them that they're encouraged to keep going. Now, when I suggest this to my students, we then typically have an argument of whether then is Tom Bombadil Christ? And I was like, I don't think so. But he does have these logos sort of characteristics, right? That he is and master and names. He's talking about naming things, and he gives the hobbits this structure of story that they fall into. So there is a kind of logo, like Christological. There's a logo. I don't want to say logocentric because that's not quite the word. So there's a logical. There is a Christological character that he has. My students are not always happy with that because they don't always know enough about the Christianity to appreciate the deep resonance that these stories would have for Tolkien, which I'm going to try to persuade you of over the course of these videos. So sometimes what they do is say, well, maybe he's Tolkien, right? It's like Tolkien is the framing storyteller for everything. The problem is, to a certain extent, all the characters are Tolkien, right? And we'll have ways in which we see, Tolkien is wrestling, as he does in those letters when people are saying, who's Tom Bombadil? And he's like, well, he's an enigma. I don't really know. Well, he's something I had earlier in my own storytelling, so, I was using him as something that it's, well, okay, don't get too philosophical. It's like, you see Tolkien always wrestling with his own creativity, and I think, that he's working at such a deep level in his engagement with his source material, with and I will continually press to you that his major source material is scripture, but he's saying that it's folding in with his languages, it's folding in with his trying to make sense of, well, I live in this landscape where there are these barrow mounds, and there's stories about water hags, and there's badgers, which don't end up in The Hobbit, right? We don't have animal adventures typically of the kind that they have in Narnia. That he's always trying to figure out the way in which everything fits into this majestic whole, right? And saying that if I do this, I hope others will participate in this majestic whole. That his primary impulse, Tolkien's primary impulse, is always to want to find the way in which all of these stories connect and interweave, and no matter where he came up with it, make those symbols interact and find correspondence and interlock. And that's why I think always fundamentally what he's doing is a liturgical exercise in finding connections and correspondences and figures and relationships. And that Tom Bombadil is the first clue that we have in The Lord of the Rings that is the way the story is going to play out. So, I guess in a sentence, it's like, who is Tom Bombadil? I think he's our test. I think he is our test of whether or not we, like the hobbits, are willing to be enchanted. Thank you for joining me, and we will carry on with our story next time.